I do want to let you know that at the end, if we have time, we will take some questions from the audience. So please do type them into the, you'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So please type your questions there and we will try to get to them at the end. So we're delighted to have Winston first with this introduction. He was a managing director for the North American office of, and the director of the North American office of CIC, China's Sovereign Wealth Fund. He's written books, the most recent of which was Digital War, How China's Tech Power Shapes the Future of AI. And Paul Triolo is equally an amazing expert. He, as Nina said, leads the Eurasia Group's geotech practice, focusing on cybersecurity, internet governance, AI, et cetera. And he was also a senior member of the US government, serving in various positions, focusing on China's rise as a science and technology power. So we've really got an amazing duo here tonight. So let's hand it over to you, Winston, so you can set the stage for us, and then I'll come back. Paul and I will come back in a few minutes.
Okay, so let me share the screen. Can you see the PPT okay?
Not yet. Nope, we can't.
Oh, okay.
Let's try it again.
Yeah. So
there we go. I can see it's coming.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
Beautiful.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Right. Today, we talk about the U.S.-China semiconductor chips war. But for me, my whole career, and as well as all the friends here, right? We all benefit a lot from the U.S.-China synergies. In my case, I was born in China, but I got education both in China and the U.S. I was a lawyer. I started undergrad major in semiconductor material science, believe it or not. But even though I was a top student there, I went to law school, so I became a Chinese lawyer. But then I came to the States, I became a U.S. lawyer, and then I had the Wall Street experience at the J.P. Morgan and the Barclays Capital New York before I went to CIC. So you could say that, before I worked at CIC for global investments, I got the training from the U.S. Wall Street, and now I'm back in New York and still working on this China-U.S. stories, and I certainly hope that through platforms like China Institute, right, we can continue to find U.S.-China synergies in every possible way. So to put today's discussion in context, I want to ask the audience to for 5 seconds to think about what was the brand, a Chinese smartphone brand that had the best ranking in the US in history. Like which brand of Chinese smartphone got the most market share in the US? I guess, for many people, they may think about Huawei, because it was, on the US sanction list for such a long time. And some people may think about Xiaomi because it is now, exceeding Apple, right? But a few years ago, actually that brand was ZTE. ZTE, very few people heard about it, but that time ZTE was the #1 Chinese brand in the U.S. market 5 years ago. It was #4 global in the U.S. market because Apple was #1, and the two South Korea brands, LG and Samsung, were second and third. So ZTE did very well. Actually, they were very smart in marketing. In New York, they become the sponsor of New York Knicks. So 5 years ago, you could see ZTE advertisement at the Madison Square Garden in New York City, and it was also a sponsor to many other teams, including Golden State Warriors, which achieved the NBA championship 2015. So at that time, ZTE was really on a roll, right? It was like on a fast break, in the U.S. market. But that expansion, was blocked by Mr. Trump. It literally got blocked. in 2017, President Trump put a sanction on ZTE, and to the amazement or horror of the global audience on that situation, especially for the people in China. Within a few days, ZTE's operation came to a stop. For a big company, large market share, but within a few days, the company's operation came to an end, come to a screeching halt because President Trump stopped the supply of chips to ZTE. Actually, ZTE was put on the sanction list, so it could no longer purchase semiconductor components from U.S. suppliers, and that was a huge moment. That was a huge moment, not only for the tech industry, but also for China-U.S. geopolitical relationship. From the China side, they see the soft belly of China's digital economy, which is the access to the semiconductor chips, which are mostly controlled by the U.S. Market, and because of that, China had a big change in terms of the concept of innovation, and these are reflected in my recent books. 2016, my book title about China's tech revolution was China's mobile economy. In 2016, everyone was talking about smartphone, mobile payment, and the user traffic on the mobile internet. However, by 2020/21, for my latest book, the title is The Digital War: How China's Tech Power Shapes the Future of AI, Blockchain, and the Cyberspace. And the difference between these two books, it reflects the evolution of China's perception of innovation. Right now, China's focus of innovation is digital technologies. It's no longer about mobile internet and business model innovation. It's not about super apps anymore. It's about hard deep tech in the digital industries, such as AI, blockchain, cloud computing, e-commerce, electric cars, so on and so forth, right? So one great example is blockchain. Obviously you will be surprised I mentioned blockchain because you all know China prohibits crypto trading, but that's the bifurcated approach by the China government. Even though they prohibit the trading of cryptos and bitcoins, China government actually viewed blockchain as a critical technology. 2019, President Xi called for more research and investment into blockchain technology, which was the first major economy leader to promote blockchain research in its country. And this has opened up a new frontier, for the U.S.-China tech competition. The example of that is blockchain-based digital currency. China is likely to be the first major economy to introduce a sovereign digital currency. Actually, could be within a year, because the plan is to launch the digital currency in 2022 Winter Olympics. And it's very hard for many to grasp that actually China is a few years ahead of US and Europe in terms of researching and launching a sovereign digital currency nationwide. Now, back to the chip, right? Whether it's a blockchain, digital currency, what have you, everything needs to be supported by chips. And because US controls so much production and the equipment that produces chips, China considers semiconductor technology as a neck choking technology, meaning that the China supply chain is subject to US sanctions anytime. In 2019, China imported $306 billion worth of chips, and in 2020, actually the number is 350 billion. So that makes the chip the largest import for China. So that proves the point. So China's reaction is twofold, right? One is to try to acquire technologies through acquisitions in foreign markets, and for that, U.S. has done has blocked a lot of transactions that Chinese capital wanted to achieve. And another aspect is just do it yourself, right? So speaking from a sovereign wealth fund background, and then relating to my another new book, The Hunt for Unicorn, how sovereign funds become new venture capitalists. China set up a semiconductor fund. It's a $30 billion size, and the result of that is a tremendous amount of new startups in the semiconductors industry in China. Now, for a lot of companies, I finished my opening introduction with one particular example. For many semiconductor companies in China, they got caught up in this China-US rivalry. On the China side, lots of resources, lots of support, and on the US side, lots of sanctions, lots of limitations. So and delistings. So if you look at the SMIC, as example, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation based in Shanghai. So on the China side, it is viewed as a national champion for chip manufacturing. So 2020, it received $2 billion plus investments from China's semiconductor funds, both from the National Semiconductor Fund and a similar fund in Shanghai by the Shanghai government. And then also in the same year, 2020, the company got listed at the Shanghai Stock Board, a new exchange that's almost like the NASDAQ of China. So in the summer of 2020, the company reached all-time high valuation. That's a good story, right? But soon, the U.S. takes action. Late in 2020, SMIC was put on the entity list and the stock ban list by the U.S. government. Entity list means the company will have a lot of difficulties to have access to technologies in the foreign markets. And the stock ban list means the U.S. investors can no longer invest in that stock. So the company will lose a very important financing channel, i.e. the U.S. investors. Yeah, and as this moves on, in January 2021, the company got delisted from all U.S. exchanges. Not only the NYSE, the main board, but also the small exchange, the OTC markets. It's completely out of the U.S. trading market. And further to that, because of the stock ban list, all the major stock indexes removed SMIC from them. So new investors in the US can access their stock either directly or through index. So that's a good example of companies that got caught up in this US-China chip rivalry. So I finished with this with this page, right? I call it a new start because a lot of the rivalry started during the time of President Trump. Yeah, there was a lot of expectation that after the transition between Biden and Trump, things would be changed, right? But when you look into it, actually, it's just a new start for another 4 years because the competition is on and actually probably is accelerating. On the Biden side, in February this year, Biden issued an executive order to expand domestic production of semiconductors so that the U.S. is less reliant on foreign suppliers. And from the China side, during the annual work report of the central government, it was decided to increase R&D spending by more than 7% per year between 2021 and 2025 in pursuit of major breakthroughs in technology. And you bet that semiconductor is one of those critical technologies that China wanted to achieve major breakthroughs. So the race is on and is still on. So I close my presentation here. Linda, back to you.
Fantastic. I'm glad you've joined the screen, Paul. Thank you, Winston. That was really fascinating. And Paul, actually, I want to start before I in a moment, I want to give you a sort of broad question, but first, just to follow up on something that Winston just was talking about. He talked about SMIC being put China's most important semiconductor manufacturing company, right, being put on the entities list. It talked about how the United States essentially crushed ZTE, within a matter of a couple of days. That certainly sounds like the United States is a malicious player and sort of a nasty player. That sort of, why are they doing this? So before I ask you, it sort of segues into the broader question of why is this so strategically important to the US? But what was going on? Like SMIC going on the entities list. What's the reason for that? What's the reason for cracking down, attacking ZTE? What's the sort of rationale on the US side?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, there wasn't one thing. I mean, in the case of ZTE, originally they were placed on the entity list in 2016 by the Obama administration, and that was a result of violations of Iran sanctions law. And actually, ZTE sent a team of lawyers to Washington, D.C. They negotiated a settlement, and they were removed from the entity list in 2016 because at that time, the political relationship between the U.S. and China was better. And the Commerce Department wanted to, was looking out for the industry and trying not to disrupt either the semiconductor or the telecommunications industry. And so they reached an agreement. ZTE paid a fine and disciplined some executives, and they were off the list. Now, fast forward to when Trump came in, and basically what Winston was referring to was a decision by the Trump administration that ZTE was not living up to its obligations under the agreement they had signed in 2016, so put them back on the entities list, and that again was a very seminal moment. I totally agree with Winston on that, because it revealed that despite many years of China trying to reduce its dependence, Chinese companies trying to reduce their dependence on the U.S. for semiconductors, ZTE had something like 250 suppliers in the U.S. of semiconductors or and other components, not just semiconductors. And so when they were cut off, they were immediately their whole product line was threatened. And they also had a lot of debt that they were servicing, and they were, because a publicly held company, unlike Huawei, for example. And so they were in a world of trouble. But if you remember, shortly after that, and I can still remember that weekend, President Xi and President Xi and Trump got on the phone and basically came to an agreement to bail out ZTE and take them off the entity list again. That was in the summer of July, I believe, of 2018. And so then ZTE was saved. And so ironically, what we have now is ZTE is not on the entity list, and so ZTE is able to produce or is able to purchase any semiconductors they want. While later on, and we can talk about it, Huawei was put on the entity list for different reasons, and that had a huge impact on, of course, on Huawei's business lines also, because they were less dependent than ZTE, but they were still pretty heavily dependent. And particularly, I think that the missing piece that we can talk about here is Taiwan, because what happens then is Taiwan gets dragged into this. And so I think, but maybe we should step back and talk about the industry before that. But basically, SMIC then, let me just quickly ask about SMIC. Great question. SMIC got caught up in sort of broader issues around U.S. concern about military modernization in China, and the idea that the U.S. government does not want China to have advanced semiconductor manufacturing capabilities, because those could be channeled, the products of those could be used in military systems, or in military high performance computers for modeling military systems. So SMIC was put on the entity list, but in addition, they were put on this other Chinese military industrial complex companies list, which is what resulted in their being delisted from U.S. exchanges. The entity list action, I think it's very important to note, had specified the types of technology that SMIC was restricted from getting on the manufacturing and tooling side, and that was for things that were below 10 nanometers. And so basically, the U.S. was cutting off, again, the most advanced technology and capabilities, but allowing SMIC to purchase things for 14 and 28 nanometers, more mature nodes, where they're very capable of manufacturing. So the U.S. was trying to sort of make a distinction. We want to keep SMIC from getting more advanced technologies, but they are still allowed to purchase tooling from the U.S. at those more mature nodes. So the U.S. government policy on this is in general has been a little uneven, right? It's not a well thought out strategy here. I think And I think the title of this is very good. I want to thank the Institute and you for inviting me here. But I think, the title here, it is sort of a race, but I think it's more, really the problem is, what role will China play in the global division of labor in the semiconductor industry, right? Because that's the real question, and there's no good, nobody has a good answer to that, because historically the industry has been, market driven, heavily capital intensive, free flows of labor and capital and products and goods across borders. And now we're in a different era, where geopolitical issues have come into play here. And so the challenge within this new world order for semiconductors is, what is China's role? That's really the big question.
Right. Okay. And before, so let me just continue with you for a second, Paul, to help us understand the American perspective. So, okay, you're saying it's what role will China play in the semiconductor industry? So why is that such an important, national security issue for the US? If you could just, I know this will seem like very basic stuff to you, but it's worth sort of spelling out why it matters.
Well, I think there's a couple of factors here. So I think it helps to sort of look at China's semiconductor industry development in some stages, right? Before 2000, pretty much we're importing everything and not a whole lot of domestic capacity. Between 2001 and 2013, China started to develop some indigenous capacity. That's when you see SMIC come on the scene late in that era. And also you see late in that era, the rise, for example, of China's design side of the house. And so design is another important part of the industry. And so you see companies, for example, like HiSilicon, which is the chip design arm of Huawei, starting to become very capable in that period, and starting to use contract manufacturing in Taiwan at TSMC, which is a key part of this whole equation. And TSMC is a global leader in what's so-called foundry, the foundry business. They're a pure play foundry. So they manufacture semiconductors designed by other companies, and they manufacture them at very cutting edge nodes, if you will. So if you look in your smartphone, any smartphone that you have, a good number of the chips in there that are the core, that provide the core functions, are manufactured at TSMC. Some of them might be manufactured at Samsung in South Korea, but probably a good chunk of them are manufactured.
You were saying that Huawei's design arm was starting to design chips that TSMC was manufacturing?
Absolutely. So HiSilicon, so the model in the industry that has evolved very fast during the 2000s, from 2000 to 2020, the model was companies like Apple and Nvidia and Qualcomm and Huawei and ZTE and others started to design their own chips in-house. And then they could use tools, software design tools, so-called electronic design automation tools, which were, again, controlled by U.S. companies, which is interesting. So a lot of the tooling and the design tools are dominated by U.S. companies that have large market share. But then the foundries in Taiwan use those tools and use that software to actually manufacture the semiconductors. And so during this period, the foundry model that TSMC and Morris Chang pioneered became sort of the dominant paradigm in the industry at the cutting edge. You still have companies like Intel, which is an integrated device manufacturer, for example, that manufactures their own chips in-house. But the vast majority of what you use in your day-to-day life are chips manufactured designed by companies and manufactured in Taiwan. I drive a Tesla, for example, and the AI chips that are doing all the video processing for my Tesla were designed by Tesla and manufactured at TSMC in Taiwan, right? So that model is really important, because that's sort of the dominant model in the industry. But what happened then is in 2018, as Winston noted, in 2017, 2018, the US began using its dominant position, the U.S. company's dominant position in the manufacturing of tools, in particular, to start penalizing companies, right? So this is ZTE. The reason they were hurt was because, in that case, they were designing but they were mostly buying commodity semiconductors from U.S. companies. But the big difference then was Huawei. If we fast forward to 2020, Huawei was put on the entity list, but then the U.S. extended the export control to companies like TSMC in Taiwan that were manufacturing semiconductors using U.S. technology on behalf of Huawei. Right, so that was a huge change in the game of export controls, and it also really shook up the whole semiconductor industry supply chain, and probably contributed a fair amount to the global chip shortage that we're facing now. So to step back to what your original question, what is the U.S. concern here? So the U.S. concern over semiconductors in China, it was originally, there were several factors. One of the original driving concerns was that China had set up this national IC investment fund, which Winston mentioned, in 2014. And that was a huge fund. I think if you look at all the regional and municipal level funds, we're talking $150 billion. Former Secretary Penny Pritzker called this China's attempt to expropriate the global supply chain for semiconductors, right? So that was the thing that really set off, I think, U.S. concern about this whole sector. That was in 2016, in the late years of the Obama administration. So the idea was, look, you have this global market-driven industry, and China is going to use subsidies for its companies, and that's going to distort the market and really disrupt things. Now, that's a long-term view of the industry. That hasn't really happened yet, because as we can talk about, Chinese companies, and depending on what the sector you're talking about, have not actually been able to take that largesse from the Chinese government and become huge players yet in the industry. They've made some inroads in memory, in 3D NAND, and in DRAM, but they're not really dominating any particular sector. In fact, I wrote an article for SupChina earlier this year or late last year, where I said, stop calling China a technology superpower, right? I mean, they're not. It depends on what the sector you're talking about here. And in some areas, Chinese companies are very, very good and are global players. But in semiconductors, both in manufacturing and in tool manufacturing, they're not, right? There's a lot of effort that's gone into to making them better, but you have to look at this historically. From 2000, where there was no domestic production, to 2021, there's been a huge, China has come way up the learning curve, particularly in design.
Yeah. So can I jump in with a question for Winston? Sure. I'm really curious, that $150 billion IC fund, why hasn't it been more successful in terms of China developing the capability to, design, manufacture sophisticated chips? Have there been some roadblocks, or what's been the challenge?
Well, the quick answer is it is a very difficult sector.
Right.
It's rocket science, right? It's even harder than rocket science.
Yeah.
It is. The quick data point here is obviously me, right? Because I was a top student of the neuroscience major back at the Fudan University, but I chose to go into law school for graduate studies. But the more data points was from my classmates, right? I always say I knew the industry is very difficult because my classmates are still in the industry. They have not left the country, those companies, large semiconductor companies, to become VC guys. If it's an easy sector, my classmates should be in venture capital right now, but they're still working at the large companies. Why? Because this industry is really unique. It is one of the most capital intensive and research and
R&D intensive
industries.
Yeah.
So, no other industry has this characteristic. A steel industry is capital intensive, right? Yeah. Pharmaceutical is R&D intensive, but no other industry is both. So we're dealing with a very difficult industry. In order to create, to build up a fabrication facility, to manufacture chips, it's about like $20 billion cost, and that is more than a cost of an aircraft carrier.
It costs $20 billion to do what? To
set up a new fabrication facility.
An advanced fab.
Yeah.
And Paul may say, may even need more. Yeah. Only two fabricators there that Paul mentioned, right? TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea are really leading this game.
Is that it? So let me pause again for a second, just to totally, step back and people. So the manufacturers at this moment are Samsung, TSMC, Intel. You said, Paul, does it in-house.
If you're talking about it, it's very important to distinguish in the industry between the cutting edge, right? Which is this is really only TSMC, Samsung, and Intel. And then there's lots of second-tier companies like Global Foundries, Infineon, IBM. I mean, there's lots of other players at the second tier. But what's happened over the last 20 years is you've gone from 15 or so companies at the cutting edge to 3. And that's because of those issues that Winston mentioned, is the capital, the R&D intensity to keep up at the cutting edge has gone up, 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 and up. And so now for you to, it's one thing to just build a $20 billion fab, right? Then you have to equip it, and you have to, with both tools and with people, and then you have to get it running at commercial output, so-called commercial yields. And that is really, really, really hard to do, right?
Yeah.
So I'll give you a quick example. So TSMC, for example, is a company that has mastered the technology at the cutting edge to produce semiconductors at 7 and below nanometers. That's the sort of line width between the features on the chip. And they're using so-called extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment to do that. This is manufactured by one company in the world, ASML, the Dutch company in the Netherlands.
I wanted to talk about.
And it has 5,000 different, it requires 5,000 different suppliers to make that piece of equipment. And it requires a team of PhDs to actually install it and get it running. So TSMC is one of the few companies that has mastered the EUV technology at the cutting edge. Intel, for example, has had a lot of trouble with EUV lithography. Right now, they may be getting back on top. In 2023, 2024, they're a very capable company, very capable engineering company, but they've had a lot of trouble with it. Samsung is also producing at nodes below 7 nanometers using EUV.
That UV lithography. What is
extreme ultraviolet lithography?
Okay.
It's the sort of it's used to put the features to actually translate a semiconductor design onto a semiconductor wafer that is then manufactured through many steps. There's about 1,000 steps that a semiconductor chip goes through from start to finish. But that's one of the most important, because that allows you to shrink the size of the chip down, and that also has a huge. It means that you can operate with lower power, and at higher capacity, and at the really cutting edge. So that's really critical technology. Now, getting back to China, the U.S. government also, so in addition to some of these other export controls, the U.S. government in the 2017-2018 timeframe put pressure on the Dutch government. This is all sort of behind the scenes to disallow SMIC from acquiring an EUV system. And that's a huge thing, because, as I said, there's only one manufacturer in the world of that. So there's nowhere for SMIC to go as an alternative. So SMIC is essentially stuck at about 10 nanometers, between 10 and 7 nanometers.
Got it. So I want to talk about, there are two acronyms that I want everybody in our audience to remember tonight. One is TSMC. And so I want to drill down a little bit deeper into that. And the other one is ASML, because I think people don't know just how important.
A year ago, nobody had ever heard of any of these companies, and now people, and now people can actually talk about extreme ultraviolet lithography with a little bit of dangerous knowledge.
So TSMC, though, can we talk a little bit about, Winston, you talked about that chokehold. Like, they have a chokehold in a sense. I mean, I am fascinated. I want to hear you both talk about how important TSMC is for mainland China, and how important TSMC is for the United States, and that there's this wrestling match going on, right? The US trying to persuade TSMC to build a foundry in the US. Can you talk about this a little bit? Like, why, how important is TSMC first to China?
Yes, it's super important. For example, Huawei is really dependent on TSMC's manufactured chip supply. About 1/6 of the revenue of TSMC comes from Huawei.
Wow.
It used to come from Huawei.
Used to, exactly. Now, when they cut this off, right, two very big impact. One, on Huawei, all of a sudden their smartphone market share is coming down, which is now taken up by Xiaomi. That's why Xiaomi is now surpassing Apple, in the global ranking. Another impact is on TSMC itself.
So Huawei's smartphone share has gone down as a result
off a cliff.
Got it. Okay.
Exactly. And another impact, interestingly, is on the TSMC itself, right? The immediate one is they lose like 1/6 of their revenue, so their R&D spending is taking a hit, right? But more importantly, because of the strategic relationship, right? They now have to develop a relationship with the U.S. to continue their business, right? Because the U.S. sanction, as Paul mentioned, right, is not only about the supply itself. It is also about you use U.S. technology to create products to supply entities on the
That's
list.
a really huge. People don't appreciate how big a deal that is, right?
Wait a sec. So walk us through that again.
Paul, please. Yeah.
Sure. So this gets back to sort of the U.S. export control and the sort of strategic view on this industry. So the entity list, which was used against ZTE, as Winston noted, and Huawei, it was really not designed for the era of semiconductor manufacturing and supply chains and dual-use technology. It was designed for an era when national security meant weapons of mass destruction.
Yep.
And so it was designed to target small companies supplying, beryllium or some exotic material that was only used in the nuclear industry to Iran or to some other country. So when the Trump administration came in, they didn't realize this. So they said, hey, let's put Huawei on the entity list, or let's put ZTE on the entity list. And it turned out that companies, the entity list only restricted sales from US-based facilities, US origin facilities. So companies like Intel and Qualcomm and others that were supplying Huawei could supply Huawei from facilities outside the US. So immediately the US government and the Trump administration China hawks saw this as US companies circumventing the intent of the US export control entity list action. So over a year and a half time, they devised what they called an extension to the foreign direct product rule. And that was what Winston's talking about. So that specified that companies that were manufacturing semiconductors that used US equipment, and by definition, every semiconductor company in the world that is manufacturing semiconductors uses a significant amount of US technology. And the rule was any company manufacturing for Huawei that uses US technology has to have a license to do that. And there's a presumption of denial, right? So right away when this was announced, TSMC announced publicly that it was cutting off its relationship with Huawei. Now, Huawei was at the time in the middle of manufacturing advanced 5G semiconductors for your smartphone, right? And Huawei was really the leader, the global leader in sort of 5G technology, both for handsets like smartphones and for the infrastructure around 5G, base stations and the whole edifice of infrastructure and antennas that support 5G. So this was this immediately basically put Huawei's two major business lines in jeopardy because they could not iterate. And again, this is a very competitive industry. I don't know how often you change your smartphone. I change mine every year. But so the design is a constant design cycle of advanced semiconductors. And so TSMC and its clients like Huawei are working very closely together on those designs and on those manufacturing processes. So that's the sort of secret sauce of the industry and the secret sauce of TSMC. It doesn't just manufacture stuff. It works both with the tool makers who are designing new tools and advancing innovation in the tool side to do better stuff and make things smaller and faster and more energy efficient. And it works with its clients to push the design into new areas in the industry. And that's why today it manufactures 92% of global semiconductors at the most advanced nodes, right? And that's a model that
TSMC manufactures 92%.
92% at the most advanced nodes, just at 7 and below nanometers. TSMC manufactures 92% of those semiconductors globally. So again, that's every advanced chip in your smartphone. That's that's a whole range of semiconductors that are at the cutting edge, right? And that's not necessarily a huge portion of the overall semiconductor market, but it's important for a lot of things we do on a sort of day-to-day basis, and for things that the pandemic, for example, has made indispensable, like working, studying, and entertaining from home. All the infrastructure behind that, data centers, mobile networks, those are all riding on semiconductors that are at pretty advanced levels.
So one more question about TSMC, and then Winston, I want to ask you about China's strategy. But so talk a little bit about, I guess Biden has put aside or is pushing through $52 billion of funding towards high technology semiconductors, right? Something like that. And so I'm curious as to, is that about trying to get spending that money to get TSMC to set up a foundry in the US, or what, why is that something
Yeah,
that's
that's a part of it. That's a big part of the new administration's work. Actually, it started at the last year of the Trump administration, and the Biden administration carries that on. I think it's a big part. Like the TSMC, setting up a joint venture in Arizona in the coming years is a very big part of this Trump-Biden strategy.
okay?
It has two big implications. One, the TSMC Arizona joint venture, right, can pull high-end chip manufacturing outside of China's reach.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and at the same time, it established a leading semiconductor foundry on the U.S. land, which wasn't there before. Paul?
Right. Got it.
Yeah,
So,
that's a great point, Winston. I think, just stepping back quickly, I think the driving force behind this was a sense that this reliance on Taiwan, because of the presence of China and the potential geopolitical implications of China feeling that Taiwan is an integral part of China, made it unsuitable or just unsustainable to continue to have the world's leading technology companies rely to such a degree on Taiwan. Now, there are other factors there, like there's water shortages in Taiwan. Semiconductor manufacturing is very water intensive, and there's typhoons that come through Taiwan. So in some sense, having that much concentration at the high end is sort of, a little bit worrying to the world's tech executives. So the US last year, as Winston notes, the industry pushed for this basically push for the US government to support and subsidize advanced manufacturing. All other countries do this, and many other countries do this. Germany, Israel, Taiwan does this, of course, and China. So every country is now in the business of subsidizing and onshoring to some degree advanced semiconductor manufacturing. And so the US finally, with the CHIPS Act, was passed in January. The funding is still held up in bills in Congress, which we think will likely be passed later this year. But the $52 billion is out to 2026, and that will help fund not only the Arizona facility that TSMC is building, but probably other facilities. The US is going to try to attract Samsung to expand. Samsung already has a manufacturing facility, but not at the cutting edge. And so this will be the start. This is really a 10-year, the way to look about this is it's a 10-year process where the US and the EU both have about 10% now of global semiconductor manufacturing, and both want to get to about 20% by 2030. The question is, how do you do that, right? And it's complicated, right? Because as I said earlier, this is a very market-driven industry. And the reason that all these clusters, like in Taiwan for manufacturing, in Taiwan and China for packaging and testing, in Japan for materials that are critical, chemicals that are critical to semiconductors, the reason that's happened is there's been some specialization in the supply chains of the industry. It's geographically spread out very widely over the globe. So no one country does everything, but there are these clusters of excellence, and that's been driven by the market and by the successive models like TSMC in Taiwan. So in a sense now, the governments like in the US and in the EU, which is really trying to do this too, are sort of now stepping up their interference, you can argue, in the market for these geopolitical reasons. Yeah. And the sensitivity around China and Taiwan and the US, right? And so the problem is envisioning how this is going to play out between now and 2030 is complicated because, building one facility, TSMC is building one facility, that's not going to really move the needle. Intel is also, of course, a huge player here, and Intel has already pledged to build two $20 billion facilities in Arizona. And so Intel is going to be a big player in this. And then Intel is also likely going to build facilities in Europe. And TSMC is being courted by the European Commission to build a facility in Europe. Now, TSMC, just quickly, is a very conservative culture. They've got a great setup in Taiwan. They get all the water and the electricity and the support from the government. And so they're not really eager to do this, right? Left to their own devices, they would build everything in Taiwan, and they're very good at it.
Nor does the Taiwan government want them to.
Right, that's right. The Taiwan government sees this as a political hedge against China, right? Against the potential. China, of course, would have no interest in doing anything in Taiwan when its companies are dependent on Taiwan just as much as U.S. companies are, right? So yes, the Taiwan government views the concentration there as a good thing, but everybody else views it as a bad thing, right? So Taiwan and TSMC are bowing to political pressure from the U.S. to site this facility in Arizona. Now, it may eventually be what's called a gigafab, which would be almost like 5 different units of a fab, and that would actually make a big difference if TSMC is going to invest, more than just a small facility, but invest in a really what they call a gigafab, of which they have, several dozen in Taiwan. And then if Intel builds a couple of big facilities and Samsung does, then by 2030, you can see the US moving the needle towards having a much bigger chunk of that advanced segment of the manufacturing sector. But that's going to require a sustained, industrial policy essentially on the part of the US government.
Right.
And TSMC is a little bit skeptical of that, right? They're not sure, is the US committed to this? You also need a lot of engineers, a lot of well-trained engineers. You need water. Arizona is not exactly a place where there's a lot of water, right? And so there's a lot of concern in the TSMC and within the industry about whether the US is serious about committing to this long-term goal of reducing their dependence on Taiwan.
Again, everybody's got to remember TSMC. But before we turn to questions from the audience,
so many questions, right? Q&A.
Yeah, Winston, I do want to turn to questions from the audience. But first, Winston, I need to ask you to talk a little bit about what is China's strategy in terms of developing. You see this sort of parallel self-reliance move, right? The US is trying to develop its own self-reliance, and China, of course, is pushing towards self-reliance. So what is the strategy? Is China just sort of funding like crazy? What's going on?
Yeah, I think that's basically it, right? Like it starts with China's digital transformation, right?
Yeah.
It's a fourth industrial revolution, and we talked about that. That the chip is at the center of every industrial revolution, from blockchain to cloud computing, everything. And secondly, because China imports so much chips from the US, and the global semiconductor technology and equipment are, both the softer side IP and the hard side equipment are mostly in the hands of US companies. China feels, this is something like neck choking, right? So they try to be self-sustainable. And so the next step is, since it is so capital intensive, and it is so, and it is also like a research development intensive, China sees this as an area that they want to they want to aggregate resources of the nation to make a breakthrough. So in the China word, in the Chinese saying, it is put resources together to do the big things. And the semiconductor sector is clearly one of those big things. So right now, what do you see? What do you see is, not only on the capital side, but on the policy side, right? Last couple of months, we saw this big tech regulation, internet industry-related regulations coming in, antitrust, personal data limit restrictions, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, policy was very supportive to hard tech, semiconductor research, etc. Right? So what do you see is a tremendous policy shift. I think, to your question, this is the most important thing. So you see, like, this new decade is a big shift from the last decade, which focused on internet economy, mobile traffic, mobile payment, etc. Right now, the focus is on harder technology, digital technologies, and R&D. So this is not only just about policy, but also about the capital markets, investment world, a lot of profound implications.
Yeah, that's great, Winston. Let me just quickly add, a really the 14th five-year plan that came out in March, the shift towards, from sort of e-commerce and digital economy more towards the hard tech space. But I think Chinese government policy was changing even before this. As a result of some of the things we've been talking about, and Winston has articulated, when the U.S. started imposing these export controls, this was not unnoticed in China, and there are a lot of experts that are advising the Chinese government that understand very well global semiconductor supply chains. And so I think what's happened is there are several tracks being pursued here. And I've written a paper for the American Affairs Journal. I put the link in here earlier this year, where I laid out sort of in a lot more detail the state of China's semiconductor industry and sort of where I see it headed. think that there are two big tracks. One is this sort of sharpening and providing resources for internal policy to push adoption technologies, including semiconductors. So this is so-called secure and controllable technologies that the Chinese government is urging its companies to try to find alternatives that are domestically produced. And that's a huge thing. And this move towards hard tech, which is a really big signal from the top, I think has really accelerated that. And also the state of U.S.-China relations, which is pretty bad now. I think that the Chinese industry now realizes that they really have to be more innovative in this sector and really reduce reliance on U.S. technology. And really allow the domestic industry to develop. The second track though is developing new approaches to financing for the sector and new economic policies to incentivize investment in domestic capabilities. Because again, this is something that can't be done, from the top down. This has to be a deft combination of government incentives and market incentives. And so that's why, for example, the STAR market in Shanghai is so important. That's whereas Winston noted, SMIC when they left the U.S. markets, they listed in Shanghai, $8 billion IPO, and dozens of other smaller semiconductors are also listed on the STAR market and are in the pipeline to be listed in the STAR market. So that's going to be really critical, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years, is to see how those companies do, because this is a long game. This is not a sprint. It's a marathon. It takes time to develop these capabilities and to develop the talent. And investors have to be patient too, right? I mean, if you bought stock in Nvidia 15 years ago, you didn't make an instant success. But if you'd held on to that stock, now companies like Nvidia and Apple that are leading in the semiconductor space, they've been quite a good investment. But it takes time, right? And the industry is cyclical, and you can have downturns in the industry. I think now with the pandemic and with the sort of 5G and mobile communications, the demand. And so that's a good thing for China, because the domestic market in China is huge. There's a ready market. The constraints, though, as I mentioned earlier, are still around on the production side, around domestic production, around SMIC, and not being able to access that technology. And importantly, the last thing, if the U.S. steps up those export controls. So, for example, one example I'll give you quickly is Phytium, which is a Chinese CPU maker, was put on the entity list by the Biden administration. That process started in the Trump era, but the Biden team went ahead and put them on the list. Now, if the U.S. extends that foreign direct product rule, and there has been discussion of this in Washington in the last few months, extends that to Phytium, essentially cutting off another Chinese company from manufacturing in Taiwan. That has a huge political implications, because talk about things like pushing up against unknown red lines. How is Beijing going to react to this? I mean, it's one thing to have your leading tech company. It's like having the Apple cut off from manufacturing in TSMC, right? And the U.S. has taken that action against Huawei. If it happens again, and some people have said, well, all the companies on the entity list should extend that same restriction. That would be huge, because so many Chinese companies that are designing at the cutting edge are using Taiwan. All the AI companies, all the handset companies like Xiaomi, others. So that would be a huge step. So those two, the sort of domestic constraint around technology, access to technology, and U.S. government actions going forward are going to be a critical determinant of where China's semiconductor industry develops going forward.
I want to ask, unfortunately, we could talk about this. There's so much to cover, and you guys are so brilliant on this, but I want to follow up with Winston, though, because it seems like, Paul, you sort of touched on something which seems like a crucially important question. You said this can't be done from the top down. You need the top down and the market. But so Winston, I guess the question, and there's a question from the audience too, which is saying, the question from the audience is, Paul mentioned that semiconductors require advanced capital equipment, software, and chemicals. How far ahead is China in the development of each of these areas? So the question I want to ask to sort of build on that is, does China, despite the export controls issue, all that stuff, does China have certain advantages in the sense that you can do things from the top down? China can say to its companies, use domestic technology, right? The United States can't do that. And the other thing anyway, let me just throw that to you, Winston, just to ask, is there an advantage in a way that they will be able to pull this off?
Well, one advantage China has obviously is the market, right? The market has a demand, and the demand can give the companies the the money, the capital, the resources to create next generation semiconductor chips. So for example, relating to electric cars, right? So in that area, maybe China and the US are more or less at the same starting line, especially from the design side, right? But when you come to the manufacturing side, China is still way behind. For several reasons. One, because of the sanctions, they cannot get access to the advanced equipment like ASML you talked about in Dutch, right? And also, more subtly, but super important is that if you are not in the supply chain, actually you miss out a lot of information. Because this is about like advanced manufacturing. So it's not, so it's like rocket science, but it's not rocket science, right? It's actually about a practical kind of test, trial and error, right? You need to be in the global supply chain to get all those information from your upstream partners, from your downstream partners, in order to, let's say, improve your actions. But when China is got cut out of that system, that's a big disadvantage.
Right.
That's a great point. I think that's a huge point that I think people miss. It's not just technology, it's not money, it's really that sort of intangible engineering know-how that you have to accumulate. That's exactly why TSMC leads, because they have been at it for 25 years and they've attracted a lot of really good engineers, and they have a lot of implicit knowledge that you can't steal, by the way, either. You can't steal that, either through one employee walking out the door or through cyber means. It has to be developed, in-house and over time. And that's one of the main reasons I think that China is, and again, China is behind only in the sense that it started late, right? So it's not, it's silly to say, well, China will never get to a certain point. But the problem is that this industry is so, as Winston has mentioned, is so capital intensive and people intensive and R&D intensive that it's really hard to catch up to the cutting edge, because the cutting edge is always moving out. And one of the problems that Chinese companies will have is getting there, but they've already made a lot of progress. And so I think in the next 5 to 10 years, there are going to be breakthroughs. They will be competitive in some areas. But the other problem is there's so many different pieces of that supply chain, and no country ever has been able to master all of those to the level you need to be sort of self-sufficient. So that's why I said, getting back to my original point, I think the real question should be where is China's sort of natural position? Where are Chinese companies playing in the global division of labor and semiconductors? And the problem there is, if the U.S. government's actions, sort of disrupt that process, which we're seeing, then it's going to be harder to see where that natural because we don't really know that. And the other thing is the subsidies. I think the U.S. government is very concerned about those subsidies on the Chinese side. But again, that's sort of a mixed bag. Those subsidies haven't resulted in in huge progress, but nevertheless, the U.S. government is rightly concerned about those, because the potential for those to disrupt this very market-driven industry over time. But I think I think that the last thing I'll leave you with is I talked to the CEO of a leading U.S. company, and I said hey, I asked him, I said when are the Chinese ever going to catch up to you? This is sort of your title here. And he said, well, I have a great company. We have tens of thousands of really good engineers, and I can only move the needle in the market a little bit, right? Was that this is getting back to what Winston said. This is really hard business, and so you have to sort of accumulate the sort of knowledge and personnel, and then then you're in the game, right? And you have that implicit knowledge, et cetera. And that takes time. So in some sense, you could argue it's a matter of time before Chinese companies accumulate that experience, and they do have the advantage, which other countries and companies don't have, of that huge domestic market. So there's going to be, the demand is going to be there, the capital will be there, also from venture capitalists like the very able Winston, and from and the government playing a role in that all. So I think I'm optimistic, and I just hope that that the U.S. and China relationship doesn't get so bad that we have a situation where that market-driven and sort of free flow of information and people and capital gets disrupted, because I think that everybody loses in that, right? The innovation particularly suffers, right? If that virtuous 40-year cycle that we've seen that has led us to be, to have just think of the capability embodied in this device. It's unbelievable, right? And that's because of the semiconductor industry has been allowed to flourish in a very, market-driven and sort of free fashion. And if that changes that equation, then, we're going to be paying. I'm not going to be able to pay, less than $1,000 for this amount of capability. And
it's very worse, right? You may have to use different phones in different countries. Even worse.
Right.
Yeah.
And by the way, that gadget that you just lifted up, this is a product of U.S.-China collaboration.
Absolutely.
So,
it's a global product.
There's
stuff from every country, many countries in the world. This is the epitome of globalization, right? Of successful globalization, you could argue.
Well, I wish we could talk all night, but we have to respect people's time. And I'm so grateful to the two of you. You're absolutely brilliant. I think that, when you began the conversation, Winston, by talking about hoping that we'll continue to find U.S.-China synergies.
Right.
And, it sounds pretty daunting right now, but hopefully, there will be ways. I mean, as we watch these two countries try to protect their national security and develop the technologies that they need. But we hope that we hope the same thing. That's what China Institute is all about, is trying to promote some kind of dialogue, some kind of, collaboration for the greater good. So anyway, thank you so much for racing us through this very complicated subject. And there's one thing I just wanted to mention, which just to sort of repeat it again, something you said, Paul, just now, which I think is lost on a lot of Americans. And that is that bringing down ZTE, or, sort of blocking Huawei, is the equivalent of bringing down an Apple. And, it's like going after Apple. It's like, I think we Americans don't realize how big a deal that was in China for the United States to do that. It's really major. And so
huge, yeah.
Yeah.
And Huawei makes very, very good phones. The cameras in there are amazing. They're made by Leica, a German company, and again, it's
Wow.
the secret sauce here is how those are integrated. All that capability is integrated into such a small package, and those leading companies in the world that do that are really, there's not a lot of them, but they rely on this global sort of supply chain that has been very innovative. And I think we mess with that at our own peril. That's the thought I'll leave you with, because I think we don't really know where this leads if we have too much, more disruption in that arena. And we've seen it already with the global chip shortage, right? Where it's cost jobs in the U.S. auto industry, right? And
Right.
That's a big deal.
Did you want to throw out some final words, Winston, as well?
No, I'm still optimistic that it will be an industry cycle, because I think the companies are both sides. U.S. Chinese companies are both hurt by this disruption. Like Chinese companies do not get supply, U.S. companies lose a significant amount of revenue, right? And at some point, the both sides will reach a better equilibrium. Instead of lose-lose, maybe better to get a win-win.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to go with Winston's optimism there, and I must say I'm very honored to be on with Winston, because I'm a big fan. I recommend everything he's written. He has a unique view of this industry and of the sort of U.S.-China tech situation. So I'm really honored, and thank you, Dorinda, for hosting this.
Well, we're so thrilled, and I will say that I'm a big fan of both of you guys. That everybody in the audience should go out and read Paul's papers, which are absolutely brilliant.
And I have a confession, right? I used some Paul's paper for my book, right?
Oh, fantastic.
I'm honored, believe me.
Got to go out and read Winston's book. So thank you again. Okay. Please come again, and we hope to see all of you again. Thanks for joining us tonight.
My LinkedIn.
You can talk about blockchain more, right? Okay.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thanks all. Thanks, Winston.